Good morning, everybody. Let me also start with thanking the organizers for inviting me. The Trondheim conferences have been very influential over the last years for agenda setting, triggering new debates, and from my very personal perspective, the conference in 2016 has a very specific task to make sure that biodiversity plays an important role when it comes to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Ambitious plans, big party in New York on the 25th of September, it was agreed by heads of state, and now we have to start implementing it. And if we look forward to what's going to happen at country level, all states have to set their national priorities and to start drafting implementation of the SDGs. And at global level, the high-level political forum, we have to be very careful in really reaching out to the decision makers with good proposals how to use biodiversity for the implementation of the SDGs. I'm not only talking about protection and conservation, I'm talking about sustainable use of biodiversity for the implementation of the SDGs as sustainable development. I'm here today to present the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity for agriculture and food. TEEBAgriFood sounds complex and is very complex. And what we are trying to do in this analysis, it's a global project hosted by UNEP, is to try to cover the complex interactions between agriculture, natural capital, and social capital, and look at the whole food chain, look at the whole production, consumption, interaction from an economic perspective. And the first panel this morning made very clear that if you look from different perspectives on agriculture, you come to different results. And we would like to bring this together in order to provide, and this is my first slide, if it works. I hope you've given the right, yeah, here. The TEEBAgriFood study is designed to provide where do I have to tone? A comprehensive economic evaluation of the eco-agri-food systems complex. So we try to look in a coherent way at the production of food, processing, distribution, and also consumption. And we would like to demonstrate that the economic environment in which farmers are operating is highly distorted. And it was already mentioned by the representative of the private sector in the first panel. If two cars crash on the street, it's a contribution to increase GDP. If a farmer is using pollination-friendly practices, doesn't show up in GDP. So something must be wrong because we do not really look at natural capital and at social capital. And what we would like to do in TEEBAgriFood is we would like to capture the whole eco-agri-food system along the chain, and we would like to do a comprehensive analysis of it. People are talking about agriculture from different perspectives. One perspective is there's a lot of good things in agriculture. So agriculture provides jobs for 1.3 billion people. The biggest sector in the world, the really biggest sector, and it's very often underestimated what jobs in agriculture means for rural areas. Smallholder farmers provide in some regions of the world up to 80% of all food, and there are more than 475 million smallholder farms. Again, the biggest economic sector in the world. And the food agriculture produces enough kilocalories for everybody. 2,800 kilocalories. Nobody should go to bed hungry, but at the same time we know more than 800 million people are hungry. Sometimes people are talking about agriculture from the bad side. 80% of all agricultural land has replaced tropical forests. There's another example. Crop and livestock farming are contributing to climate change. And agriculture utilizes on global average 70% of all water withdrawn, and we know that the next wars in some water scarce regions of the world will be about water. And of course, 825 million people are hungry. The challenge in an analysis of the food system is that all these perspectives are true. Depending on the perspective you are coming from, you could say we are producing enough kilocalories for everybody, great. Or you could say, sorry, you are cutting down too much forests and you're degrading land, you have to change it again. How can we bring these different perspectives together in order to have a comprehensive analysis of the agricultural system, including the food chain? And let me use another example. We all know that agriculture and the food system today is producing a lot of waste. 1.3 billion tons of food every year is wasted. 50% in developing countries and 50% in developed countries for very different reasons. Could you imagine an industry producing smartphones, throwing away every third phone before it's used? This industry will be bankrupt overnight. The current agricultural system is producing 30% of waste every year, and if you would translate it into CO2 equivalents, waste as greenhouse gas emitter, waste would be the third biggest emitter in the world. After China and the United States, food waste is the third biggest emitter of CO2 equivalents in the world. So something is wrong with the food system, and if we look from different perspectives at the system, we will never agree on what do we have to change to make the food system real sustainable. And that's where TEEBAgriFood wants to contribute to the debate. And we would like to invite you to join forces in order to get this comprehensive analysis right. So what are we trying to do? Normally, food systems start with seeds and inputs, crops and yields. And we would like to look at the interaction between human systems and biodiversity and ecosystems. The traditional analysis of agriculture and food says we have to look at the inputs. You see them here: irrigation, fertilizer, pesticides, breeding, labor, biotechnology, and we have to look at the outputs: employment, food and nutrition, fuels, fibers, and agritourism. This is the traditional evaluation: the costs of inputs, the prices of outputs, and then farmers more or less survive. By the way, if you look at the global food system today, I'm really worried. It's not only Europe where farmers don't get fair prices. A liter of milk in Europe, 20-25 euro cents. If you go to a shop and you buy a liter of water, it's 40 or 45 euro cents. So farmers get only 50% for a liter of milk, what you have to pay for a liter of water. And this is not only Europe. I have seen in a newspaper that Australia is now providing new support to dairy farmers because their farmers cannot survive. In the United States, more than 500,000 tons of cheese is somewhere in the stocks and nobody wants to eat it. So we are trapped in a situation where the predominant paradigm, let's produce food very cheap, leads to a situation where farmers cannot survive and where food systems are at risk. So if you only look at input-output ratios, you will not create a sustainable food system. And therefore, we have decided to look also at other things. We call it visible and invisible externalities. For example, the contribution of ecosystems to food production. We all know that without pest control by nature or ecosystems, without fresh water, you cannot produce food. This is not accounted for. This is for free. And also if you look at the contribution of food to human systems, access to recreation, if farmers are managing landscape, nobody is paying them. If you look at cultural heritage, very important for many countries, farmers don't get paid for it. Additionally, you see that production of agriculture also has some impacts, some negative impacts. Loss of ecosystem complexity, species reduction, soil erosion, greenhouse gas emissions, and you also see that there is some negative impact on human health. Of course, no food is very bad. But having the wrong food in the long run has very high costs. So if you look at this whole comprehensive way, that's what we want to do in TEEBAgriFood, to do an analysis of these complex interactions between ecosystems, agricultural production, food processing and distribution, and human health. So how can we do it? First of all, it's very clear that we don't want to monetize nature. This would be a big misunderstanding. If people think we would like to put a price tag on nature, and then if you use nature and destroy it, you have to pay a little bit. We would like to start with a comprehensive analysis of these interactions, because we are convinced that the system overall is distorted. We do not provide the right incentives, and therefore it is very, very difficult to transform our agricultural systems, our food systems, into more sustainable systems. Let's go back for 1 second to the SDGs. The SDGs in overall don't say, let's produce more. They say, let's transform the way we are doing development. All countries, including, I'm coming from Germany, my country. When it comes to our ecological footprint of our food system, we cannot continue with business as usual. We have to change, we have to transform our way. And this needs new international collaboration, needs new partnerships, but it also needs an economic framework where farmers can really do it, and where we set the right incentives, and we don't pay farmers for destroying the environment, and do not support farmers who are stewards of genetic diversity, for example. And therefore, this is the scheme we would like to apply to different production systems. What I'm going to do now is to look at one commodity, maize production or corn production, in order to exemplify what could be a possible way to do the analysis. And we are doing it based on input we have received from Conapio, from Mexico, and I would like to present a narrative to you. What does it mean when we are talking about producing maize? And let me tell you right from the beginning, there are many different ways to produce maize, and if someone says we have to increase the production of maize by 60% to feed the world, you should always ask, sorry, which maize are you meaning? Which production system? And that's what I'm going to present now. If we look at agriculture overall, maize plays a very important role. Maize is one of the most important crops in agriculture. Production of maize has increased twice as much as the harvested area. Area of maize cultivation increased since 1990 by 41%. Production increased by 111%. So people could say, oh, that's a good result. We have increased production, that's what we need. But if we look at the average maize yields globally, it's 5.5 tons. Expected to reach 6.5 tons by 2025 and 8.6 tons by 2050. So it seems to increase. But global averages mean nothing. There is a story of a man who fell into a river, and this river was on average 25 centimeters deep, and he drowned because he fell in the river on the wrong place, and there it was 2 meters 50. And therefore, always be very careful if people tell you on global average we are fine. This might hide very, very big disasters. Yields per hectare in Africa are 1.5 to 2, and in North America, 7.4 to 9.9. So there's a huge range. And these, I would like to explain what is behind. So if you look at maize production, we have 3 global production systems. First, the very intensive systems. Profit-oriented enterprises, private sector, very strong, expert knowledge, hired workforce, mechanization, high inputs and high outputs. And then we have the world of smallholders, and they are not only smaller intensive systems, they are very different systems by nature. They are predominantly rain-fed, very different production systems, very different management practices, very often subsistence or semi-subsistence systems. They depend on traditional knowledge. They are using what the world today calls agroecology. And we have system number 3, that's the organic. It's both small and big. I would like to concentrate in the following on the difference between A and B intensive and smallholders to make very clear that also for research and investment, we have to be clear what we are talking about. So let's start about what is maize used for in the world. Mainly, it's not direct food. I will give you the figures. Only 14% in the world of all maize is used, 14 as direct food. 55% as animal feed, so indirect food, and there is 20 to 23% for industrial purposes, including ethanol, sweeteners, and oil industry. In the United States, for example, there's only 1% of all maize corn used as direct food. The rest is divided half-half animal feed and industrial uses. The maize supply chain is very heterogeneous, and it's defined by its ultimate use, and historically it was very, very different. So if we look at direct food maize, the small part, it's very often related to poor rural communities. It's a stable food. It has nothing to do with the intensive maize production in parts of the industrialized world. It has nothing to do with intensive production for animal feed. Consumption of maize is important for 900 million people, and that's their stable. So if we talk about maize, we also should ask, what are we talking about? Maize for ethanol? If we increase the yields and intensify production for ethanol, this has nothing to do with feeding poor people in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of Asia. And we are also talking about different varieties. Small-scale farmers very often use white maize as their staple, and this is only a small fraction of the yellow maize. And now I would like to come to biodiversity and different systems, but it's not working. I know there's another slide. Here we are. Small-scale systems are very high in biodiversity, and they have to, because this is a natural insurance scheme for the farmers. They don't have any other insurance scheme. They cannot rely on one variety, and they are using it very often in mixed cropping systems. So the advantage of biodiversity for small-scale farmers is that it's an insurance, that they can combine it with different production systems, and in the end, it leads to a highly nutritious food. It's very often marketed only locally or regionally, and it's based on land races, so traditional maize varieties. We have a lot of different production systems. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, you can identify 8 different production systems where maize is used together with a lot of other fruits and vegetables, and you have very nutritious food in the end. If you look at the 2 systems I have presented, this is the traditional system. Small-scale producers, grains, forage, markets, very often very local. If you look at the industrial maize, you see refineries, dry millers, distillers, different uses, and I will come back to it. So if we are talking about mainstreaming biodiversity in agriculture, and we are using the example of maize, it is very different if we are talking about this system, which is highly biodiverse today, or if we're talking about this system, which is diverse, but only when it comes to processing and distribution. It had nothing to do with biodiversity. And therefore, there is not one agricultural system, there are several agricultural systems, and we have to look at the value of the different systems, and I will come to the implication of this system pretty soon. Let me concentrate on one product of the industrial maize system. It's called high fructose corn syrup. You can produce it out of maize. It's one of the fastest growing businesses in the United States, and in other countries. It is used as a sweetener for soft drinks, fruit juices, bread, marmalades. You can find it everywhere in the supermarkets. Sugar is still used a lot more, but the increase in use in the last years was very high. So intensified, efficient production of yellow maize in industrialized systems, one of the outcomes is cheap sweeteners for soft drinks. And if we look at the increased use of it, over the last 50 years, the average annual consumption per person of these high-calorie sweeteners in the US increased a lot. 80% was made out of corn. You all know that in different parts of the world, Europe, US, there are different support schemes for farmers to produce. And there's a calculation that, of course, in the end, you also support the production of sweeteners for soft drinks. This is a rough calculation. I'm not so sure if these are the only figures or if you could do the calculation in a different way. But the result is we have a development which creates a lot of costs. Intensive, efficient, and subsidized production of sweeteners had led to decreased prices of sweeteners for soft drinks, and at the same time, the cost of fresh fruits and vegetables went up. And this leads to a situation where the whole world is now talking about how could we fight diabetes. And it's very disconnected from the question, what are we producing in agriculture? WHO has made a very threatening report. This is an original slide from WHO, catastrophic medical expenditure because of people with diabetes. I don't say this is only related to maize, but it is related also to maize. Annual costs of diabetes, 827 billion. Losses in GDP, 1.7 trillion because of diabetes. So we are in a situation where the production of a cheap, efficient agricultural product, on the one hand, leads to very high costs in the health system. And therefore, we have to look at the whole chain. I'm convinced if you only want to slightly change maize production, you will not find a solution for this problem. And I had the pleasure to participate in UNEA 2 last week in Nairobi when I arrived at the airport. I bought one of these nice little newspapers while waiting for a taxi. The biggest article on page 2 was increasing costs for diabetes in Kenya. The medical system doesn't know how to deal with it. And therefore, the question when we are talking about food is, how expensive is really cheap food? And what kind of production systems do we need to produce healthy foods? And what role plays biodiversity in it? So we have to look at the whole package and not be very narrow, look only at the price of a kilogram maize produced. We have to ask for what is it produced and what are the intended or unintended side effects. And of course, production of maize, intensive maize, is a precondition for animal production. Now, I would like to say to the representative of the World Farmers Organizations, I don't want to say we should not eat meat. We have to look at how are we producing meat? What are the costs of producing cheap meat? And what are the intended and unintended consequences for it? And we know that the concentrated animal feeding operations, the feedlots, they are based on cheap animal feed, that's very often maize. And if we look at what are the consequences, you all know the environmental consequences, what to do with the manure, and we have an increased debate about the use of antibiotics. And one of the most challenging issues for human health at planetary scale is the question, do we have enough antibiotics to deal with diseases? And we are running out of antibiotics because of antibiotic resistances. And only in the European Union alone, drug-resistant bacteria, this is not only because of animal breeding. No, it's a broad range, also abuse in hospitals and our wrong behavior, but it's also linked to the way how we are using antibiotics in intensive livestock production. very high costs. WHO again says the costs will be very high for antibiotics, and it's a threat to human resistance to antibiotics could bring the end of modern medicine as we know it. And again, I would like to draw a very long line. What kind of agricultural production systems do we have? What are we producing? How are we dealing with the environment? And what are the unintended and intended side effects? If we don't do it in a holistic way, we will never be able to transform agriculture to a more sustainable production system. My very last slide is, of course, you all know that there are dead zones in the oceans. If you look at the Corn Belt in one country, or Iowa, Illinois, and you see that there are a lot of nutrients flowing into the sea. And this is very much linked to the intensive production of maize, both for sweeteners, for livestock, but not direct use as food. And what we have to do together is to look in a comprehensive way at our food production systems, because the narrow, silo-oriented view will give us wrong results. And my very last sentence, Mr. Chair, is we all know that the current agricultural and food production systems, they are not sustainable. They're not sustainable today, and they're not sustainable tomorrow under very different conditions. And what we like to do is to present an approach for an integrated assessment for a sustainable agricultural system, for a sustainable food system to feed the whole world. Thank you very much.